me introduce Robert. He's an artist who examines spatial environments and notions of utopia in large-scale, multi-layered acrylic works. Through dystopian cityscapes, landscapes, and floral still life arrangements, his work addresses the ecological impact of humanity on the landscape. A background on where he's come from, he received his Master's of Fine Arts from the San Francisco Art Institute and his BFA from the Tyler School of Art. His work has been exhibited nationally, including solo shows at Raina Branson Projects, Marine Contemporary, Electric Works, Eleanor Harwood Gallery, as well as group and two-person exhibitions, including some at the Torrance Art Museum, Museum of Contemporary Art San Diego, the DeRosa Palo Alto Art Center, Johansson Projects, Waterhouse and Dodd, Schneider Museum of Art, Yerba Buena Center for the Arts, and the San Francisco Arts Commission Gallery. He's a recipient of the Murphy and Cadogan Fellowship by the San Francisco Foundation and the Carmela Corso Scholarship by Tyler School of Art. He's completed multiple murals and public artworks nationally. He's been also a resident at the Bemis Center for Contemporary Arts, the Headlands Center of the Arts, and Vermont Studio Center. His art's been published in publications such as New American Paintings multiple times, Beautiful Decay, a book entitled Mural Art, Large-Scale Art from Walls Around the World. His work has also been reviewed in the LA Times, Modern Painters, San Francisco Chronicle, Art Limited, and featured in Art Week LA, 7x7 Magazine, and the Huffington Post. He has taught art at Stanford University, the San Francisco Art Institute, and the University of Washington, currently where he's a visiting professor. He currently lives in Oakland because it's better than San Francisco. All right, let's let Robert take it away.
I tend to like to start out art talks about my work with a few examples of mural paintings that I've done in the past. I started out sort of professionally working in public art in the Philadelphia Mural Arts Program, which is a really well-funded, community-driven public art organization that really sort of works to beautify neighborhoods. It involves a lot of community activism and integration, and there was a big part of my education, I think, sort of paralleling my time at Tyler as an undergrad, and spent a good 5 years or so in between and during my undergraduate degree kind of working in different public spaces around the city and working under different artists with students, teaching, many different things. So it was a really robust sort of education and sort of has a lot to do with some of the perspectives that I've taken in terms of art making. So this is a mural in Northeast Philadelphia at Martin Luther King High School, which was the last mural I did in Philadelphia before moving to the Bay Area for my graduate degree. And it's about 150 feet wide, maybe it's about a two-story building, so probably 30, 40 feet high. And this was a very common practice where we would work with the community members of the school, for example, or whatever the site is where we were working, to sort of concept the artwork, work on designs, and then often execute it all as a collaborative kind of endeavor. I managed to do some of this similar work also in San Francisco. This is a project I did in Chinatown, which is an alleyway right near a City Lights bookstore, if you guys are familiar with it, in North Beach. It's sort of this alleyway that connects both Chinatown and North Beach. And this was a similar project where I worked with several different projects. This is one example of a project I did in Chinatown where we were working with kind of local teenagers and picking out different sites and working with the community to kind of come up with ideas and developing and painting murals. I've been involved a bit in other types of public art as well. This is a project that I did more this year, last year. And it was through the San Francisco Arts Commission. It's a project that is called Art on Market Streets. And it was specific to dealing with the Arts Commission's collection. So that is a very broad definition. It's basically any artwork that the Arts Commission had in their possession. So it could be anything from something in an airport to something that was a public statue or something like that. So for this competition, essentially, I focused on statuary of Golden Gate Park as a subject, and basically isolated 6 different statues that I felt had something to do with San Francisco's history, identity, character, and tried to sort of dive into the history of each sculpture and tell a little bit about its story that you might not know. So, for example, actually I'll switch to a different one. For example, the piece on the right is a depiction of John McLaren, who was a sort of early politician, which in San Francisco, who is basically responsible for the creation of Golden Gate Park. And there's a lot of interesting tidbits, like his statue is currently in Golden Gate Park, but when he died, it lived in somebody's backyard in Berkeley for many years because he refused to have it. He didn't want statues in the park at all, and he preferred to kind of be among nature. He was kind of a very naturalist guy, not unlike John Muir, who was a very famous, also local character who was very big into naturalism and preserving nature. And so this, against his wishes, basically the statue was made of him, basically, on the ground, no pedestal, among the trees, and eventually after he died, it was put into the park, so it did eventually get placed in there. But it's an image of him with a superimposed image of Golden Gate Park, so it sort of kind of tells a little bit about him and his story. Another piece here is on the right is sort of kicked off the whole concept for me for this body of work. It's called Portals of the Past, which was the name of this facade which exists in Golden Gate Park in front of a reflecting pool, which is the only monument dedicated to people who died in the 1906 earthquake in San Francisco, which kind of decimated the city as a sort of famous earthquake, which destroyed most of San Francisco. And it's a facade. The house that originally stood around the facade is depicted in the piece, so it's sort of picking up the history of the statue that you might not necessarily have known about, and sort of trying to connect the past and the present. Figure this is mostly an artist background. I thought I'd show you guys some examples of my process in terms of developing a proposal. So this is a photographic collage that I often work from sort of Photoshop collages, depending on how clear I am on what I want to achieve with the painting. And particularly for a proposal type situation in a public art setting, you have to go through a lot of rounds of proposing an idea, what it would look like, how it might be reproduced, etc. The final project for all these, I think I'm mistaken to have not put any installation shots, but the posters themselves, these are all paintings on paper that then got reproduced as posters that then got put in bus kiosks up and down Market Street in San Francisco for 3 months. So it's a very kind of high-profile public piece. So they want to make sure they know what they're getting before they hire artists to do this. So this is some examples of kind of how I started the process. I kind of isolated the idea, I kind of found the imagery, and kind of worked with it together to kind of put it together to propose the idea. So jumping back again, this is 2009, and this is sort of a student show of mine at San Francisco Art Institute nearing my time as a graduate student. And I like to show this as a first sort of image to start with my work as I sort of see it today, because I think that it sort of is the beginning of what embodies a lot of characters of the work that I'm making. And while I don't do as much installation type components as often now, particularly with the painting, you can start to see a lot of interests that are still with me today. And I was a very figurative artist in the past, very sort of classically minded in a lot of ways, and I really kind of went to graduate school to sort of figure out how I wanted to work as a painter. I'd been involved in public art, and I'd been involved in painting as a studio practice, and it was a sort of struggle with a lot of my work and sort of a tone of voice in terms of having a sort of more publicly minded, broader concept that was very easily discernible, and studio work that was less so, maybe more intimate, a little more questioning, less broad and consumable. So as I was making work and changing things and experimenting over the 2 years at SFAI, I found myself more interested in the works that I was making once I started to take the figures out of the environments. partially because I felt like the depiction of a figure was really kind of dictating the conversation around the paintings, and I was really more interested in the sort of topics introduced about people, but not necessarily depicting them. So I started kind of getting involved more in landscape and thinking about how you can almost depict people without depicting them specifically, and sort of, using graffiti as a way of kind of making a marker of the existence of humans in a space versus actually depicting them full on, right? And additionally, I started kind of really being interested in stretching the ways I was using acrylic paint, which was something that I was kind of sticking to, and I started playing with spraying acrylic paint, pouring it, stenciling it, all these different kind of ways of applying the paint, so that it was really working in a way that was beyond what oil paint was doing or could do, for example, in some ways. This was my graduate show, and you can start to see some semblance of the sort of conglomeration of the sort of influence of urban landscape, landscape painting, sort of nods to sort of history of landscape painting, particularly in kind of Western traditions, such as like the Hudson School of Painters, and sort of really exploring and starting to really get into different ways of working with acrylic paint on a large scale. This piece is 5x7, and this one is 5x8, both from 2009. So I work a lot from photography that I either take or find, and this is an example of sort of a site that I would pass by frequently next to my studio, and would found as an inspiration to sort of be reinterpreted as a painting. So you can see that I will often use these sort of collages as a jumping off point, which also often is just that. It's sort of a starting point. It's not necessarily about being faithful to the image, but as a sort of inspiration. And that practice has a sort of lineage back to the mural paintings that I was doing even before graduate school. It was a common practice where you'd have to come up with imagery very quickly for approval or for discussion, and a lot of the artists that were working with the Philadelphia Mural Arts Program would use Photoshop a lot to kind of quickly collage images together, and it's still something I do today. These are a few examples of different landscape pieces that I've been making. This one's from 2011, I believe, and it's still a subject matter that I deal with currently, and I've found various ways of approaching it. Part of the interest in using this sort of combination of images and sort of combining photographs that I find and images that I've used is that it sort of creates this non-space, right? So the thing that I kind of like to think about or talk about is that the images are sort of utopian in that they are not of a specific place. They're not portraits of New York City or California even. Although I think very influenced by living in California, in part not being from there, and part picking up from my surroundings as part of my resources for my imagery. And another, and sort of being interested in that sort of utopian or non sort of place, I found myself very attracted to different philosophers and thinkers and makers of utopian ideals and utopian kind of thinking. So someone like this is Buckminster Fuller, who's made these are proposals for a dome over Midtown Manhattan and a dome over the Eiffel Tower. And if you're not familiar with Buckminster Fuller, he's a very interesting character. He's someone that doesn't really fit in a box very easily, and was someone very inspiring to me, who was a writer, as a philosopher, a teacher, an engineer, and he sort of looked at humanity as a series of problems that could be solved by engineering, essentially. So he was sort of coined and most popularly noted for his geodesic domes, which you might see in various uses now today. But they have a very sort of both utopian and dystopian place in the collective conscious when you think about how utopian ideas of that were, part of Buckminster Fuller's intentions, for example, to create very affordable housing that was super strong and very easily made anywhere around the world for people of any income, right? So there was these sort of broad, aspiring goals to sort of create a higher quality of life for people. And you see this sort of imagery of the dome, as an example, sort of being appropriated and kind of turned in the realm of science fiction, right? So there's sort of a relationship between science and fiction, and science fiction being that you can have a lot more leeway, for example, and so in the sense that it being an art form of film or literature, the imagination has more room to run. And then I think you find often that artists, filmmakers, writers, painters like to take this space of fictional reality or future reality and both play with it as a possible bright future and pin it against itself as well as a sort of dystopian future. So there's this sort of slippery space where the imagination of a possible future both becomes utopian and dystopian depending on the viewpoint. This is Logan's Run still, if you guys aren't familiar with that film. It's essentially a future society that lives entirely under domes, and the outside world is essentially kind of ruined. It's a good one to rewatch if you haven't seen it. This is some images from Archigram, which was a British theoretical architectural group that was pretty active in the 60s. I believe some of the members are still around making things. And much like Buckminster Fuller, they're very interesting in that their work both was sort of practically minded in the sense that they were active architects and people who were taken very seriously, and then they're also sort of making these fantastical, bizarre images of, for example, this is a walking city, so it's different ideations of what it would mean to live in a city that moved. There's different images of floating cities and balloons and underwater cities and things like that. And it's sort of, I think, an interesting space where you have this field that's very both practical and scientific in a sense, but then also using it as a space for exploration and kind of imagining different outcomes of future possibilities. So around this time that I was sort of thinking about Buckminster Fuller, for example, or different sort of utopian philosophers and writers, I was kind of interested in artists like Matthias Weischer, who's a German painter, and these sort of interior paintings are what he's very well known for. And I've been making these sort of landscape-based paintings for several years, and I started thinking about what if I had sort of shifted the view from the viewer outside and into a landscape painting to sort of being the viewer inside, looking outside a window onto a landscape painting, thinking about these paintings as a sort of reference jumping off point. And that led me to this body of work in 2011. This is a few large paintings up at the Yerba Buena Center for the Arts. They do a sort of triannual kind of survey show of kind of what's what in the Bay Area. I was lucky enough to be included in, and these pieces were part of that show. They're each about 5 by 8, 5 by 10, 5 by 8 again. And these are all, again, still acrylic paint, very much involved with sort of creating different spaces from an amalgamation of sources, playing a little bit idea with this interior-exterior and sort of the melding of both those spaces, both in and out. This is a digital sketch for the painting that I made, so you can kind of see how I started to sort of think about, the overall tone and color and composition, and I'll go backward again just to sort of see how the piece kind of turns out. So there's certain very clear sort of similarities, but then a lot of things that just kind of change as a process. It's another digital sketch, so you can kind of see how I'd start to think about the piece and how it would change. So for several years, I was kind of working in this realm. I was thinking about these sort of spaces that were both inside, outside. A lot of them had these sort of moments of still life painting in them. You know, either you can see here on the front right, there's like a large sort of still life painting, or front and center, for example, here. And it was around this time that I had my first solo show in Los Angeles at Marine Contemporary, which has since closed. But I basically focused in on this theme for the show, and found myself really interested in the still life arrangement. So I made a few pieces that were sort of based on just still life. And I thought that there was something really nice about them. And, I think that all art making is sort of a feedback loop. So you sort of find yourself interested in things, you make them, and you find out if people are interested in them as well. And if sometimes the things you're interested in, others aren't, and if you're lucky, they're interested in them too. So it's sort of, I found myself sort of interested in these things, and they seem to be fairly popular with other people who are seeing the show. And so it led me to think more about making more of these types of setups a little more intentionally, a little more specifically. So I started thinking about, well, what does it mean to make a flower painting today, right? So still life of flowers, which is very cliche in some ways. We've all seen this type of painting a million times, right? So this is an example of a Rachel Ruysch painting, who's a Dutch painter who was very successful at the time, one of the few sort of female painters of that era that we can still kind of talk about today. And in one sense, okay, it's a pretty bouquet of flowers. We all kind of can get past that pretty quickly, probably with not very much interest. On the other end, what we know about colonialism of the time and the type of botanical examples that they had, many of the species of flowers that were depicted in these type of paintings didn't really exist locally. So what we can say is that these are also sort of a portrait of colonialism at the time. So a lot of these exotic flowers were getting plucked from different parts of the world, were accessible locally in Europe for the first time, and were used as still life paintings. So they're both something we see and know. At the same time, we can look at it in a very different way and think about it as something completely different. So thinking about that and thinking about vanitas paintings, which were also something historically very prevalent at the time, which is essentially, this is probably the most clear example of a vanitas painting I could give you. It's, we have our biological mass of the flower, we've got death, and we've got time, right? So they're essentially meditations on mortality, existence, and death. Thinking about how to bring these things into a sort of body of work, that's something that could be meaningful to me and meaningful in a contemporary setting. I started thinking about the type of flora and fauna that exists today that is sort of dying out, and created a body of work that was essentially entirely comprised of floral still life paintings of different California endangered flora and fauna. So there was a relationship to the paintings, both historically and in a contemporary context, where they're both considering, here's a digital still life, or digital example from the painting in the center here. And so they have this sort of contemporary context and a historical kind of connection as well. So on a technical basis, these are pretty complicated paintings. This is about 4 by 6 feet, so all acrylic. There's a lot of layering and detail in each one of them. I was really trying to push the sort of complexity of space, playing with, again, this has sort of been prevalent through, much of my, work, that there is an emphasis on variation of the way the materials are applied. There tends to be, and I like to try and say this at some point when I talk about my work, a very kind of hard edge with the work, which is sort of part of using a lot of stenciling and masking techniques with acrylic paint. And when you see them in person, they look very different. I like to say that they're much more painterly in person because they're very much handmade. When you look at them in person, you can see the brush strokes, you can see the layers of shapes that have been covered over and over again. And while they're sort of slick and almost computerized in their aesthetic, they are very much about hand-making process. And while they're, again, sort of as you can see, I'm showing you guys all these examples of digital collages sort of inspired by and utilizing different technologies, they're also very much about being spontaneous and intuitive, and often I don't stick with a plan as I'm making a painting. One of the few drawings in the Still Life series here. I made some prints, some screen prints from this series. I thought I'd show you guys a little progression. So this is a painting in progression from left to right. So you can see a lot of the piece kind of get covered up or changed till it's completed. So that sort of helps you imagine maybe how I get from A to B. So this was a body of work that I completed around 2013 at the Bemis Center of the Arts, actually where Damien and I met as friends. I was completing the floral still life body of work, and at the same time starting this next body of work, which was a series of 9 interrelated landscape paintings. I had been sort of working in this sort of interior-exterior realm for a while, and then sort of these still life paintings for this. So that took maybe a couple of years, and I wanted to kind of come back to landscape as a sort of home base. So I found that was probably the most of most interest to me as a subject matter. And when I found out I got this residency, I grew up on the East Coast and then moved to California and hadn't really done much in between. So I decided to take a long road trip, basically from San Francisco to Omaha, seeing all the large. Somebody okay out there? Seeing the Grand Canyon and all the sort of like large, iconic, sweeping landscapes that are so much a part of the American collective conscious. And that sort of seeped into my brain and got me thinking about what I wanted to do for this show. This is the second show I had at Marine Contemporary, and led me to this idea of this sort of interconnected sort of landscape painting that essentially acted as a long form painting or like a panorama. So each painting has the same horizon line. Each piece kind of connects to the next formally and in terms of color and tone. And, basically it goes from day to night. And they're all about 4.5 by 6 feet. This is the second piece in the process, just so you can see how they build up. Sometimes it's hard to know when to stop. And it's interesting going back to seeing them in process, so you can see what kind of develops and how much stays or how much goes. This is an example of the blue tape. Is this frisket paper that I use to kind of cover and sort of create large, complicated stencils. This was the painting in a finished state for a few years, and then about a year ago I decided to go back into it and I changed it again, so now it actually looks like this. Sometimes when paintings stick around for a while, I start messing with them, I get fidgety. Which has been interesting, because sometimes I learn a lot from that and sometimes I ruin stuff, and I think it's kind of fine if there's less to lose, because you still kind of learn something in the process. It's a digital sketch for this piece here. Actually, the last slide is an image very similar to this. I kind of decided to make another painting based off this painting. So I included some digital sketches in there so you guys can see how they relate. this painting as well has now been cannibalized, so it's a very different piece now. I'll show it to you again later. This looks familiar, I think. This is a piece that Damien and I did a year and a half ago, 2 years ago at Portland State University. We did a collaborative piece at the Littman Gallery, which was fun. We had kind of like a week to take over the space and kind of tried to find space, areas where some of our ideas overlapped and approached it in different ways. This is another collaborative mural I did with a different Portland artist, Adam Friedman, who's also teaching here. And this was at White Walls Gallery in San Francisco. It was part of a broader show that had to do with tiny piece paintings. So it was like 10-inch paintings, and then we got to do like extra 10-inch paintings in this mural project. Just to show you kind of some of the files we sent back and forth, I thought it might be interesting to see how we were thinking about the space before we painted it. This is a digital sketch that I made for a mural at Facebook headquarters, which is in Menlo Park, California, which is just in the south of San Francisco. And this is the sketch in the space. This is the space prior to any painting. It's a really interesting space. It was a really great opportunity because it's a sort of a 3-turned stairway, and I really wanted to play with the perspective that one encounters when you're walking around the space. So, as you're coming down the stairs the first way, I'm kind of extending this road in front of you, and then there's this, play on space at the corner, kind of collapsing where the space almost flattens out. The surrounding environment is this sort of very surreal, marshy landscape, and I really wanted to kind of play up on using that marshy landscape and sort of bringing the outside in some ways. So, coming up the bottom stairs, you kind of have this, upward looking to the horizon line, and so you come around and you can see this sort of very detailed, distant landscape in the distance, which is part of that environment. You kind of cross a bridge to get over into the space, and you can kind of see San Francisco on a clear day, you can kind of see Oakland on a clear day. So, I use this sort of distant cityscape quite a bit as a sort of like, civilization in the distance, but as a trope. But I kind of really wanted to play that up on this piece. I believe it's like 30 by 50 feet, something like that. I'm kind of nearing the end here. Just wanted to show you guys a few examples of more recent pieces. This is sort of more or less loosely based off of one of the pieces from that last show that I showed you. This piece is also a reinterpretation. We were talking about this earlier. The piece from the PSU show that Damien and I did in the background, this is that same painting that I reworked. So it's about 5 by 10 and, based from that show kind of. This is that painting I said a little while back was reworked. So I kind of had it, went back into it and changed it up quite a bit. It's currently at a show at the DeRosa Museum in Napa. Been working a bit with this idea of sort of like window spaces almost, I used that analogy before in terms of the inside-outside space, but I thought about using the fence as sort of a window or portal to a distant landscape. This image is a little washed out, but there's sort of these large buildings you're looking onto and this sort of distant sort of landscape that's happening back there too. This past year or so, I've been making a few of these. And probably be able to be making some more at some point. Another thing I've been playing with recently, I'm starting to kind of, these are smaller, this one here particularly is a smaller painting, it's maybe 2 by 3 feet. And I just started this like 4 by 7 foot painting that's a little more involved, using this theme of stacking rocks as again, sort of, I think what I'm interested in with the spray paint or with this idea of like stacking rocks is just this sort of metaphorical depiction of someone interacting with the landscape. So it's more about that sort of idea of the presence of someone doing something versus depicting the figure in the space specifically. Although recently I've been kind of including maybe small figures into the landscape a little bit, almost, like a Turner painting, or you'd have sort of a little fleck of red of somebody in the distance, sort of like for scale or for context of how small people are in the world kind of thing. So there's a lot of overlaps there in sort of the history and contemporary interpretation of landscape. And this is the last piece that I've finished. While I've been up in Seattle, I've been making some work, a few of which, this is actually just like an iPhone shot, but I don't have that many pieces of these new, photographs of these new pieces, so this is all I have to share at the moment. But this is a piece I just finished a few weeks ago, which is, pretty specifically based off a painting from a few years ago that I wanted to revisit. And that's all I have for you guys. So we can take some questions and answers if you're interested, and we'll go from there. So thanks. Yeah, I think it's difficult. I think it's tricky too, because I think most figurative work really deals with identity politics in certain ways that I couldn't really, or maybe didn't want to get involved with, and I think became increasingly distracting to my thought process when I wanted to make work. And so I think by sort of detracting what was getting in the way a bit, it opened up a broader space. So it's sort of, and it wasn't something I couldn't have told you that, like, I was sitting around in one moment I was like, aha, I'll just do this. I mean, it's kind of this process of just making stuff and talking about it. And I think, I think there's one painting that's not in here, but where I made this sort of like I think it was like a very suburban landscape, and there's sort of hyper color, and it was just people really responded to it. And it was just one of these things. I was like, like I was making all this work about, I was making this very kind of overtly political, these like kooky narratives, and there's sort of these little bizarre figurative elements kind of happening with the work. And I was interested in being political, kind of based on, I think, inspired by this history of kind of mural painting, sort of being active in a community setting where, like, art and painting particularly was doing something very active and saying something sort of active, even if these, the mural paintings I showed you before, they're not the most political in the sense that they're not, the message is not so overtly political, but the act of making them is the politics behind the work, right? So what I was trying to figure out in the studio practice was, how do you even make studio work that is political and says something without just hitting you over the head with a message of some kind, right? Because because it's making art in general is not it's not good for direct messaging, like slogans are, or advertising is, or literature is better at that, right? If we want those things, we don't go to art usually. Like, I think it took some time. I think I was trying to do that, but I couldn't find that many people who did it successfully, and I couldn't find a way to do that on my own, or I didn't have any role models for that, in the sense that people I felt like I could relate to, or that I had a similar voice to, and it just seemed distracting. And I think when I started thinking about landscape, I felt like I could talk a little bit more indirectly about the sort of politics of our world in some broad sense. It may sound kind of hokey, but that was sort of the idea, So oddly enough, recently I've been thinking more about reintroducing the figure in more like predominant ways. And I think it's in part because I've been teaching up at University of Washington. I'm teaching figure drawing right now, and I'm just kind of, I'm teaching a beginning painting with oil paint, and I'm just like, oh, this stuff is great. And, drawing the figure, and I'm like, oh, I can still do this, I was very, very hardcore, figurative artist for many, many years. Like, my favorite painters, probably still favorite painters, like Caravaggio, like that was what I kind of wanted to make work look like. And it's, I think in part too is tricky because, and this is like a long drawn out thing to your question, but just, it's like, how do you make figurative work contemporary or interesting? And I maybe I just wasn't, maybe, who knows, maybe in 5 years I'll be making decent figurative work, but like, I just couldn't, and I think there's a lot of artists who do make it. I just couldn't get myself in a place where I was doing that. And it just felt more interesting and unknown to me to be working in this realm, because it doesn't have anything, it has nothing to do with my prior history or interests. Like I'm just kind of like finding it out as I go, or kind of finding correlations to other artists I think are interesting and stuff like that. So it's kind of a jump off the deep end a little bit for me. But it's sort of about finding a voice, right? It's like, how do you say something in a way that is sort of authentic to you, I think.
It's very, it's encouraging to hear that process and just keep walking, basically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I think most of art making is just making stuff, thinking through it, figuring out if it worked, see if you want to do it again, getting excited, getting depressed. It's like, it goes back and forth, sometimes in the same afternoon. Yeah, that was really lucky. I mean, it was just, I guess in some senses, right place, right time. Like other cities don't have as much of that going on in an organized way. Like I think, going around Portland, there's a lot of murals and stuff like that. And most major cities, I think, are lucky. I think it's maybe even timing. Like it seems like, graffiti and graffiti art is so widely acceptable now. And a lot of artists who are sort of in the gallery world come from that background. And, the type of things, which it's also very funny to me, sometimes people think that because I say I do murals and stuff that I used to be a tagger or a graffiti artist, and I was like, far from it. These were all like, government sponsored mural projects that I was working on, a very different world. But it was just lucky that like, when I got into the Mural Arts Program, I was basically started out as an intern, and I got very lucky to have come back from a year abroad and wanted to. I studied in Rome for a year, and in my junior year, and when I got back my senior year, I really wanted to. I had applied to this thing before and not got in, and I thought it would be a good opportunity to try and kind of reacclimate to being back in the Philadelphia area. And I remember I called in, and it was like too late, but the guy who was picking the artists was waiting an extra day for his friend till he picked all the interns. And he said, well, if he's doing that for his friend, I don't see why he can't do it for you. So if you can get me an application by tomorrow, we'll look at it. And then so I pulled it all together, drove up to the city and dropped it off. And I literally got a phone call later that afternoon, and he's like, dude, you got it. Like I was going to give it to somebody else. And then he took me in as his assistant, specifically. So I got really just lucky that whatever work I was making that year, he was impressed enough with. And I learned a ton from working with this guy. So I owed a lot to him, and then he got a little more in the administrative end of like who, picking who does murals and working in the education program. He was also a Tyler School of Art alumni, so it helped a little bit, I think, to kind of be around people who were of the similar ilk, And it just kind of helped a little bit getting me from that internship phase. So there was a lot of people who were interning, and that was the end of it. But I was lucky enough to kind of like as a senior even, they were giving me projects and stuff. So it was really, I was starting to do my own murals or teaching or whatever. So I was really lucky to be kind of like working, like a working artist before I left undergrad, which was really helpful. In a city like Philly, it's great because it's cheap. And so I was getting paid pretty well as a young artist doing these really cool projects. So, it was not easy work. You were in really rough neighborhoods, often in the winter, painting outside. It was very challenging. I wouldn't necessarily jump as quick to do some of the jobs now, but it was extremely rewarding, and had a lot to do with my interest in education still, and particularly kind of the way I look at painting is sort of it can be, as a political vehicle in some ways to kind of make someone feel or think a certain way,
What about that textural stuff you're doing?
Yeah, there's some stuff more recently I've been getting into with these rocks. Gel transfers are really kind of fun, very laborious, annoying process. But you can, if you Google, Golden Paints has a great website for this kind of stuff, how to do them. But essentially, you print an image on a Xerox paper, and you coat it with like 8 coats of, or maybe 6 coats of gloss medium, and then you let that sit overnight, and you soak the back of the paper pulp, and you rub all that off, and then you're just left with this skin of the ink inside the acrylic, and you can collage it on for texture or photographic imagery. And so I've been doing that a lot with these sort of rocks of taking rock textures and sort of collaging them on to kind of get different effects. So it's sort of like underneath layer of a little bit of tone, and then this sort of skin that goes on top, and then mixing that, spatially.
So there's actually like a little depth to it?
A little bit, yeah. When you look at these paintings up close, and maybe I should include some details with this, it's kind of slow talk, but there's often a very kind of like tight little lip around each shape, which is like essentially the raised part of the paint around it. It's some sort of stencil, and you'll see those things overlap kind of here and there, because the painting is getting layered over and over again in different ways. If I showed you earlier images, like the background of this painting was much more detailed before it got like kind of eviscerated by this electric grid thing. Which is always a tricky part of when I'm working, because I don't often know how much information to leave before it's going to get covered up, so there's so much, uncovering or revealing. Part of the process too is that like the sort of little electric grid kind of thing that we're talking about is somewhat transparent, so you can still kind of see through the image. So it's your sort of the idea there being that you're both being, getting an obscured view and being able to see through it at the same time. So it's this sort of complication of space in some ways, which I'm always trying to kind of create. But yeah, you'd see little edge of maybe where the tape was kind of put down, or in the case of these gel medium transfers, maybe little like cracks in the shape where I kind of like cut a shape and glued it on. Some of the little leaves or two are also, I'll take palette scraps, like you can peel the paint off the wax paper. You can cut it into nice shapes that look a lot like little leafy shapes, and it creates a nice contrast to the flatter leafy shapes. And and on the canvas it sticks out a little bit extra too, so it's a nice little surprise when you get to it, because visually it looks like it pops, but then like physically it's coming off the canvas a little extra than it should.
You just glue it with gel medium?
Yeah, just matte medium or gloss medium and stuff. So I mostly go back and forth between, there's like a matte varnish I use, which is essentially just gloss medium but more matte, and then matte medium I use for like everything, just to make the paint more transparent, and gloss medium is a good kind of hard sealant to kind of create essentially isolation coats. I had a really great teacher in grad school who was a very adamant acrylic paint user, and not many painters teach or use acrylic in a big way, and I was sort of using this, and this is sort of what sort of started to push me into like, okay, I gotta really like figure this stuff out. Like, you can't just use acrylic paint like oil paint. It just doesn't work as well. I mean, you can, and it looks fine, but if my goal was to more like make, these are like undeniably acrylic paintings, like when you go out, they're very acrylic-y, they're plasticky. And anyway, he kind of showed me a few things that just kind of opened up the game a little bit and kind of made it much more interesting to work with. That's a good question. I think I find that when I'm making a painting and it looks too overly representational or straightforward, I think in my mind, I'm thinking this is too straightforward. I usually am trying to find some other way to make it more complicated, in a way that is a little less traditionally minded, I think. And I think that has to do with both coming from a background of sort of traditional painting in some senses, and also this idea of wanting to push the paintings to be contemporary and in a way not specific to just representation, right? So I like the idea of kind of presenting representation, but then also introducing these moments that visually and perceptually change the way you look at the painting, to know that it's not representation outright or the illusion of that. It's about sort of this complicated space that's, what painting is. Painting is this. Well, let me back up. There's a really good documentary, which is an interview of Federico Fellini, the filmmaker, and he was somebody that really I was listening to in these documentaries, and watching all his movies in grad school was very influential, as well as people like John Carpenter as a horror movie filmmaker, because there was always something slightly off about them, sometimes more than others, right? If you go to early Fellini films, there's less going on. By the time you get to 8.5, it's pretty weird, and then further on, Satyricon and all those, very, very out there. And in this interview, he's talking about basically kind of like being the puppeteer, but also showing you the strings. So it's sort of like this idea that creating the film is about this place where the viewer is kind of being taken away, but you know, it's done in such a hokey way, and sometimes in these movies that it's very clear that you are being taken away. You know, it's like putting on a show, but you know, everybody knows. You know, if you pull back far enough, you know you're in the show. You know you're being fooled in some way. But then if you make the viewer aware of the fact that they're being fooled, it takes it to this other kind of space, right? So I think that's something inherent to the way I've been trying. Like, you know, I aim to make these works. So it's, you know, both illusionistic, and I think that's why I still have this element of illusion to the work. Yeah, I don't go full on, or at least I haven't yet gone full on abstraction, you know. Because I like this idea of both creating a space which is believable, but then saying like, oh, just kidding, it's not, you know. And in part, I think that's why I work with acrylic, because it's so plasticky and fake that it both creates an illusion, but also it's like, it's not realism, right? I'm not trying to fool anyone necessarily, you know, with this very specific illusion. Just trying to create a believable illusion, but then, you know, very also aware at the same time that it's not what it is, you know.